Our students, ladies and gentlemen, today it is a remarkable time for you all who being here. Keynote speaker, we invite to be here today is so important for International Buddhist Study College. One thing I would like to tell you, the person who are the key important one to establish International Buddhist Study will be our keynote speaker today. He's Prime Minister. He's the former Prime Minister. 10 years ago, he together with his party dedicate his life and support our university and IBSC. The thing is, there are too many students from throughout the world who come to study here. The problem is, we don't have IBSC. So in order to support student monk from Mahayana, Vajrayana and Theravada from various countries, that's why our keynote speaker and his party, Democratic Party, support our university to establish. Of course, former Prime Minister, he used to study at Oxford University, Eton College, where is the place I've been there to study English language in there as well for 10 years ago. Many times I went to explore college that our former Prime Minister used to study there. Of course, now he is a friend of UK Prime Minister. He used to learn together at that time. For you all, you are so lucky because now our keynote speaker is being here to share experiences with you all. We are so lucky because he used to be Prime Minister. He is a leader. He is a political leader. So, of course, the person who used to be Prime Minister have to take more time to organize everything, to inspire many people in Thailand. If you don't have strong mindfulness, how can you organize everything more effectively? So today, we invite His Excellency Abhisit Vejjajiva to be here to share his experiences with you all. How to be mindful leader. How can we apply mindfulness to use in daily life from political leader to religious leader. So I would like to take opportunity to give the big hand to our keynote speaker together. Now I would like to take this opportunity to invite His Excellency Abhisit Vejjajiva to share his experiences with you all. Please, His Excellency.
Dr. Surapon, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me say how pleased I am to be back here. I feel a degree of attachment to this place in particular, because 10 years ago we were very much involved in trying to make sure that this could be the center of Buddhist learning, not just for Thai people, but also hopefully for the region and maybe ultimately for the world. And I'm pleased to see that much progress has been made and is continued to be made to strengthen this center of learning for Buddhism for now very much regional religious leaders, and hopefully we will ultimately reach our ambition of becoming a global center. In fact, my attachment to the university goes even beyond the 10 years, because at the time when we were pushing for legislation to set up this university, I was also very much involved, then as the chairman of the House Education Committee. And one of the things that we also managed to do was to make this university a leader, if you like, of all universities in Thailand, which is that this was a university that was set up by legislation without being part of the civil service. So now we see so many Thai universities moving towards becoming an autonomous university. This is one of the two universities that began life as an autonomous university and set an example. So I'm very pleased to be back here today. At the same time, I have to say that there's a bit of hesitation when I was invited, particularly to give this talk. Partly because I have to confess that the topic is slightly different from what I'm usually asked to speak on. Obviously, much of my lectures and talks would be focused on the economic or political or social issues and problems that we face, somewhat removed from discussions about the mind, about spiritual matters. And as was mentioned before, while I grew up here as a Buddhist in my early life, I was sent away to the UK at the age of 11 and actually spent 10 years in the United Kingdom. So I have to confess right at the outset that I'm certainly not an expert on the issue of mindfulness, and maybe when I refer to some of these issues, well, those of you sitting in front of me probably know better. But I will, what I will do certainly is to link up the problems that we face today. When I say we, not just people in this country, but actually the whole world, with this very issue of what kind of leadership, what kind of politics is needed in order to address all the problems and challenges that we see today. In particular, I know the topic says digital world, but for me, the issue of technology driving changes at the global level has been going on for a number of decades, long before there was this particular focus on the world becoming digitized. In fact, in many ways, the advancement of technology was very much behind the drive towards a phenomenon that we call globalization, which I guess up until today has been a process that has been going on for at least 2-3 decades. And what's particularly interesting to me, and I think relevant to what we want to discuss today, is how this idea that technology is now enabling all of us as humans to link up together as a global community is changing our lives and is changing the way that we address economic and political issues. And this is something that is, I guess, particularly relevant to me, because I started my political career back in 1992, which was, I guess, in many ways, a beginning of an era. Because that was when the Cold War had just ended. So there was this very idea that somehow the world, particularly post-World War II, has been dominated by a struggle between the ideologies of what is called the free world and the socialist or the communist bloc. At the time when I joined politics, that was coming to an end. Symbolically, I guess the Berlin Wall came down, and there was very much this idea that the whole world would be dominated by a philosophy which we might call liberalism and democracy, both in economic and political terms. Economically, that meant, of course, that everybody was talking about how the capitalist system, if you like, or at least the market-driven system, was here to stay and was the only realistic alternative. Indeed, at the time, there was so much talk about if you wanted economic growth, if you wanted prosperity, in the end you have to work with a market system, a capitalist system. And indeed, one of the arguments for that was that it was a system that was compatible with human nature, which is that we want to make our own choices, we want to seek our own happiness, or in economic textbooks, utilities. Politically, again, there was this idea that the ideological struggles had come to an end, that it was proven that a liberal democratic system was one that could deliver prosperity and peace, and that other alternatives had been defeated. Well, I spent 27 years in politics. I quitted the post of party leader and then subsequently gave up my seat in Parliament just a few months ago. And it's interesting because after 27 years, the premises or the assumptions that I talked about when I started my career in '92 had perhaps been proven wrong. At least there is a genuine question about whether what we thought was going to be the future of global economy and global politics didn't actually turn out the way we had anticipated. So there is very much talk now of a recession or retreat of liberal democracy. And unlike 20, 30 years ago, when you look around the world and you see economically successful countries, all of those countries would have been part of what we call the free world. Today, actually, the countries that are probably doing best economically are not characterized by being liberal democratic countries. And in fact, a number of authoritarian regimes appear to be performing better economically. I say this without meaning that I think this is something that is good, nor do I mean that this is going to be a trend that is going to stay or would replace the old assumptions, and certainly not because I support the idea that somehow we could give up some of the political ideals that I still very much believe in. But what it means for me is that since my career seems to have coincided with the rise and fall of this idea of liberal democratic domination, it's a good time to reflect about, well, what perhaps has gone wrong, and it might give us some ideas how this could be fixed. So let me just go back and start by looking at what back in the 90s appeared to be what I call the promise of globalization, or the promise of what modern technology, particularly IT was going to deliver for all of us. It was clear, in politics, anywhere in the world, the main objective is to achieve peace and prosperity. So let's take prosperity first. The idea was that people having access to this technology will have at their disposal a tool that will enable them to seek unprecedented opportunities. They can get ahead with life, they can seek higher income, pull themselves out of poverty with all the opportunities created by globalization and technology. Globalization because there would be more trade, and more trade means bigger markets, means wider opportunities for everybody. More opportunities at the individual level, more opportunities at the country level. And not only was there going to be general prosperity, the idea was that this would be shared in a more equitable way, because you no longer need to have so much capital to be part of a big organization, but you now have access to technology that will allow you to access markets, to create your own opportunities. That was a promise. And in some ways, some of it was delivered, because over the last few decades, it can be argued that we have lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. And while, yes, much of that was because of the economic progress in two countries in particular, India and China, given that they are the most populous countries in the world. But it is also true that, for instance, the progress that has been made in China without, if you like, the democratization was very much due to the fact that China had opened itself up and allowed market forces to work. So I wouldn't so much dismiss that the promise of globalization and prosperity was all fake, was not true. There has been some genuine achievements, and no small achievements in terms of the eradication of poverty among so many people in the world. But that was the promise and the hope that this would then be spread out, and that this progress would be even, would be smooth, and that we would all attain a higher quality of life. As far as peace is concerned, the idea was that if we as human beings have more access to information, which we clearly do now, compared to a few decades ago, there's a huge difference, a world of difference between what people can learn, what information people can access, compared to people that have that access now. And you can see how the younger generations, even small kids now, are able to learn and receive so much information that in our generations we could never dream of. But the idea was that people have more access to information, they will be more knowledgeable, and they would be wiser. And more important than that, as they learn about different people, different societies, different countries, different cultures, there would be a better understanding between people of diverse backgrounds. And that would then enable people to be able to live with each other despite their differences, better. That was the promise. Now, is it true that people are now more knowledgeable? Is it true that people now understand that there are different cultures, different ways of life in various countries and societies? Yes. But whether we are now wiser, that's a different question. That's a different criteria that we would have to measure things. So, if that was the promise, and if some of the hopes had been realized, why is it that when we now do a quick reality check of what's happening in the world, we do not feel that there has been progress? And in many ways, why are we so anxious and worried that perhaps things are perhaps going backwards rather than forward? And I guess there had been some events that have shaken up what would have been a smooth path towards peace and prosperity as was promised. Economically, I guess the financial crisis very much woke everybody up to the reality that markets can go very wrong, and that the system does not have a good protection or protective system or immunity from the volatility and the mistakes that people make. And I think for the West, the financial crisis a decade ago very much shook up both the economic and political structures. Because after the crisis, and there was much economic suffering, that opens the door to the kind of politics that we see today, which is nationalism, extremism, authoritarianism, and so on. And certainly, one of the most talked about topics in all political systems today is this very issue of inequality. And I know it's difficult to measure inequality in a way that is accepted by everybody, but there can be no argument that the world has become much, much more unequal. A handful of people, the wealthiest people in the world, have actually more resources than the rest of the world population. Only a handful of people. And in countries like Thailand, you look at the pattern of land ownership, of bank accounts, of incomes, and you see a growing disparity and inequality, which has led to so much tension, so much conflict, and again, allows for leaders who exploit the anger, frustration, disillusionment of people towards their own political gains. Moving away from the economic realm, I guess 9/11 as an event woke everybody up to the idea that there continues to be a marginalized group that would react in extreme ways, that the issue of violence was not going away, despite the hope and the promise that we were all going to understand each other better. And indeed, when the reaction of the West was then to go to war, that was also met with a stronger reaction in the form of ISIS, which I think for the first time actually made no excuses about the need to use violence to pursue their own ideals or their own aims. And what was scary about that was that there were so many young, educated people who actually were attracted to this idea. And actually, I come here today with the news that the ISIS leader was killed by US forces last night. But despite the president's speech, I don't think anybody in this room believes that this is going to be the end of more terrorism or more violence or more conflict around the world. And indeed, if you look at the last few decades, where we had hoped that the end of the Cold War would mean less conflict in the world, we would find that in the end, the old kind of conflicts, even before the Cold War, so conflicts between countries, conflicts between religions, conflicts between ethnicities, actually have been growing around the world. And not only that, in all countries, if you like, many people are now finding that more and more people become polarized. Unfortunately, Thailand is a leader in this in many ways. We have had a politics of polarization now for over a decade and a half. But when we look at what's happening in the US now, when we look at what's happening in Europe now, with the rise of extreme left-right wings, with less cooperation between politicians from different parties, it's all very familiar to us. It seems that everywhere people are becoming more divisive, people are becoming more polarized, and there is more tension, there is more conflict, and in many cases, the political system or working might even be argued to have broken down. I talked about democracies. When you look at the textbook, you say, well, there are two main systems of democracy, the presidential model and the parliamentary model, and we take the US and the UK as the origin of these models. Well, I don't think anybody in those two countries now feel that their politics is functioning well. In the US, you have this impeachment process going on, and a leader that clearly does not feel that the respect for the basic rule of law, or in some cases standards of decency, is important anymore in politics. And in the UK, well, they're struggling very much with the issue of Brexit, which was brought on by a decision by the whole electorate a few years ago. And again, everywhere, the level of faith and confidence in leaders, political leaders, is very much on the decline. You look at the approval ratings, for instance, of Congress in the US, is shocking. The numbers would be very, very low, you know, sometimes in single digits. And clearly that's not something that can be healthy for a democracy if elected representatives are not even trusted or approved by a majority and a strong majority of people in the country. Well, what has brought us to this? Why is it that despite unprecedented opportunities, despite having at the disposal a technology and tools for advancement of peace and prosperity, somehow humankind has not been able to take advantage of this? And why is it, actually, I should mention this before we forget, that one of the most important challenges that we all face today is the issue of climate change, which again is brought about by human behavior, and yet somehow all the knowledge or the technology is not bringing us together to have a systematic way to approach this problem, when it is almost an existential problem for the whole of humankind. Well, it would be easy to say, well, that's because in the end, we as people have not learnt from the ancient wisdom that is offered by Buddhism and other religions in the past. Of course, there is clearly truth in this. If you like, the three poisons, I don't know if I get this right, there's greed, there's anger, and there's delusion or ignorance. Clearly, all three play a big part of why we are not succeeding the way we should or the way we wanted to. After all, when I talked about the economic crisis, the problem of inequality, this is clearly linked up to the problem of greed. There's a famous saying that actually we have the resources, enough resources for everybody in the world. But we don't have enough resources even for one greedy person. And you have to ask yourself that the degree of inequality that exists today, the so-called 1%, the billionaires or maybe trillionaires, well, what is the limit of the need to seek wealth? And of course, that is something that is easy to observe. And somehow, if we cannot contain people's greed, we'll be stuck with this problem. Anger at the individual level, that's clear. Despite having this opportunity to learn and understand about people who are different from us, somehow we cannot overcome our biases, our prejudices, and are often too easy to be led or stoked up to be angry and direct anger at other people. I don't know if you saw the news about President Trump's speech last night, where you have a leader of the so-called free world basically claiming victory by killing a leader of a terrorist or a violent organization. Okay, set aside the issue that this is a killing that was not according, you didn't have any kind of process, legal, judicial process that leads to punishment. But I guess people on the whole accepted that this was somehow necessary in a fight against a terrorist organization. Okay, we can concede that much. But was it necessary for the leader of the free world to describe the events that happened? I don't know if you listened to him. Talking about, in graphic details, how the ISIS leader was hunted down by the US forces, running away from dogs, screaming, calling him a coward. Is any of that necessary? Why did he have to do it? And I guess he did it, again, to make people feel that this was all justified, that somehow violence and killing was justified. And there was even a need still to vilify somebody who has already been killed. I think that should give us a bit of pause for thought about what kind of world we now live in if, as I mentioned about greed, we are also okay with making people more angry, with making people more emotional in doing these things. And delusional ignorance, well, that is the biggest irony. Why is it that the more information we have, the more ignorant we can become. I think it was 2 years ago, the Oxford English Dictionary had to put the words like fake news as a word of the year or something. And now there's so much about disinformation that is going around. So what we see is all the information, all the knowledge can be useless if there is no wisdom in how we access, in how we learn, in how we use that information, or if we can call it knowledge at all. And in all countries, we're now struggling with this. In Thailand, the issue about the role of social media in politics, the idea that this government now wants to set up the so-called anti-fake news center to try to deal with this information. And the criticisms now that platforms like Facebook and others are coming under about enabling the fake news or disinformation to be spread out. That should obviously tell us about why there is need to reflect on the failures of the last few decades and get to the bottom of the problems. Now, this leads me to this issue of mindfulness. And if the three poisons are very much behind or are the driving forces towards this failure that we talk about, obviously training of individuals to overcome these three factors will go very much towards solving problems. But that's not my job. That's yours. As religious leaders, this is somehow a challenge for your task to be able to train and lead individuals to become wiser and to overcome these poisonous traits or characters that have undermined progress of humankind. But as somebody who is a politician and still very much interested in political developments, what I will talk about will be the more collective dimension of these problems and systematic dimension of these problems. So we're not talking about individual traits, about people sitting here, about myself, who can sometimes be greedy, who can sometimes get angry or, led by our biases and so on. But there are also inbuilt characteristics of our systems that if we don't address them, will make these problems even more acute. So like if you take greed, we have to somehow remove greed out of the market system as much as we can. When I say as much as we can, because I think we have to be realistic. Yes, a well-functioning economic system will have to be compatible with individuals' incentives. People seek material goods, people seek higher incomes, people want to become richer, they will compete. That's fine. Because I think any system that is designed to go against these becomes unrealistic. And we've learned that from the failures of some of the alternatives. But it doesn't mean that we allow a market system to operate in a way that puts no limits on greed driving people towards more and more gains without any consideration for the side effects or the damages that does to society, to countries, and even to other people. I'll give you an example, maybe a bit technical, but State enterprise is a very good case in point. In most countries, state enterprises are set up precisely because we used to recognize that the market system often doesn't work. There are certain goods and services that the government has to take care of. That's why state enterprises were set up, usually in areas like energy, transport, communications, and so on. And then somewhere along the way, we discovered that when they were set up as state enterprises, they're very inefficient. And that's because it was going against human nature when there's no competition, there's no incentive to be efficient, and it doesn't matter because when you run a state enterprise and you make a loss, you go and get money from the government, from taxpayers. And so 30 years ago, everybody started thinking, oh, let's privatize state enterprises in order to make them more efficient. Sure enough, many state enterprises that have been privatized are now more efficient. But do they serve the people or do they serve the country? We have a very hugely successful, in commercial terms, a state enterprise, say, in energy now in Thailand. And yet it can be argued that that has done much to make energy costly to ordinary people. That has actually driven more inequality into the system. So what I'm saying is we can blame the problems that we face on, say, the trait of greed in individuals, but we're not helping ourselves by setting up systems that often allow these problems or these characters to exacerbate the ills and damages that we are facing. When we look at the issue of anger, again, if we allow a political system to exploit these emotional nature of humans, we no longer make politics and democracy about people taking rational decisions. But we exploit the idea that, yes, if there is hatred, if there is fear, that is a much more powerful way of gaining support. That is a much more powerful way of discrediting your opponents. And if the system allows this, it will be exploited. And so the issue of anger, just like greed, is no longer a problem at an individual problem, but it becomes part of the system. It becomes a collective problem. I always say I quitted from politics because I tried to go against this in the last elections. When I see that one side is very much exploiting the fear of people about the other side undermining everything and threatening the security of the nation, and the other side is exploiting hatred of what they see as a dictatorial regime. But it worked. Both the sides that exploited fear and the side that exploited hatred gained a lot of support. And people were not able to step out of this politics of fear and hatred. And it still persists today, even after the elections. You look at the news, you look at the headlines, you look at the nature of political dialogue. There's so little discussion of the substance of what politics should be about, which is where the country should be heading, what kind of policies we should adopt. But it's always more about the other side is doing wrong, this side needs to do this in order to make sure that the other side does not make any gains. And on the third issue of ignorance or delusion, and again, we're back to this issue of the use of disinformation, fake news, in a very effective manner. And, you know, in the US, this talk about the interference with the previous election shows how technology allows the exploitation of this to be very efficient. Very simply put, the way people interfered with the last US elections, what they did was use a very sophisticated algorithm with big data to exploit the so-called floating or marginal voters in states that would deliver the electoral votes. And what they did was just spreading disinformation about, Hillary Clinton in that case. And it worked. You only had to target a number of people in a certain number of states, and it delivered victory to President Trump, despite him having a few million less popular votes than Hillary Clinton. So if we see these problems at the systematic and at the collective level, this is where we have to do two things. Number one is, well, how can we change the system so that it moves away from feeding power to greed, to anger, to ignorance? That's obviously quite a difficult and sophisticated question that I don't pretend to have an answer to. But at least in the second thing that we need to look for is this idea that leadership has to be mindful. So if we take the second question first and see what kind of leadership we need, and if we can agree on that, if we can understand that, then maybe we can then design the system to allow for this leadership to emerge. So, for me, what would be mindfulness or mindful leadership? What kind of mindful leadership would be needed? Well, I've come up with four important characteristics. And I've tried to categorize them under four headings, all beginning with the letter C. Yeah, just to make it easier to remember. Because I think it was mentioned earlier, yes, I saw that mindful here, I think in Thai, the word sati has been highlighted. But I think there are aspects or different dimensions of what we might call mindfulness that goes beyond or maybe is not completely captured by the word sati. So what are the four C's? The first is obviously what I would say conscious leadership. And by conscious, I mean the kind of awareness of the problems that we are facing and what the causes of the problems are. Because as Buddhists, you have to look at the suffering and seek the cause of the suffering before you can get rid of it. And this is important because being conscious or being aware is not something we see in a lot of the leadership or political leadership we see today around the world. When I say aware, I mean basically knowing what is going on, at least trying to study and understand all the phenomena. So we see a lot of the political actions very much based upon fixing the day-to-day symptoms, rather than action being based on decision from being conscious of everything around us, which is interrelated. The problem with the dominant political and economic systems is that everything is based on individuals. Whereas we know that everything in the world, not just humans, but even human with nature, is all interrelated and should be seen as one. If we were conscious of that, we wouldn't have this problem of climate change. And I see almost on a day-to-day basis how governments go around fixing one problem only to create another, because they are not aware or conscious of how things are related to each other. So for me, mindful leadership has to begin with this consciousness of being aware how things are related to each other, which then leads to the second C, which is the cognitive leadership. It's too easy to react to problems and solve it in a way that maybe perhaps people will say, okay, I'm happy you've done this, without actually thinking through or understanding the technicalities and even the basic truth about things. In Thailand now, the main economic policy is this idea that you give away money, 1,000 baht, if you're quick enough on your mobiles and laptops, so you can spend this. But we've done this, I don't know how many times over the last 5 years, and the economy hasn't picked up. But it seemed to be good enough for a lot of people because, number one, it helps, the economic numbers is going to move. When you're just handing cash around, the economic number is going to move. But is the economy stronger? Are people's lives actually becoming better? Are they more prepared for what's going on? No. So we need more cognitive leadership. And that cognition cannot come without mindfulness. That's the second C. The third is that you can be conscious, aware of the problems, how things are related. You can find solutions through this process of cognition. But you also need care and compassion, which is also another aspect of mindfulness. Because if leaders don't really care or are compassionate or have empathy with the people who suffer, with people who are facing problems, then you will see policies and solutions that basically also are aimed at political gains. It's often said that, well, some of the basic problems are never tackled because, well, if they were, then it would be a lot harder to make political gains from some of these day-to-day ad hoc policies. But you have to genuinely have the caring and compassion to come up with the right solutions. It would be far too easy to just dismiss and say, well, we've got subsidies for farmers now, we've got this 1,000 baht handout, we've got the money now for the elderly, and that's it. It will be different if there is genuine compassion about what poor people have to face, disabled people have to face, elderly people have to face. You would have to move beyond just giving money to these people. You would think about the need to design a better environment for a society that now has many more elderly people and will have many, many more in the years to come. You will think about not just handing money to the disabled, but see, well, how can we engage the disabled to have the pride of having a job, of being able to help themselves, so they can feel that they are not dependents, but also individuals that can be respected and counted upon. And this caring and compassion is not just about caring about people in general. The most important thing will be having caring and compassion even for your opponents. If you still see your political rivals and competitors as enemies, if you don't make any attempt to understand people who disagree with you, but you automatically see them as an enemy to be eliminated, then there's no way we will have a good functioning political system or a well-functioning democracy. So the care and the compassion not just is for ordinary people or the people at large, but I think it's particularly important for people with different viewpoints, different groups, different ethnicities, different cultures. That's the only way we can eliminate problems like racism, sexism, and other discriminations and prejudices around the world. And I guess the fourth and final C is conscience. Because if a leader knows what's going on, is able to come up with brilliant technical solutions, even maybe care for other people, but lacks a conscience or a degree of decency and self-respect, then we will have another C, which is one cancer of all political systems, which is corruption. So a good conscience is also part of a characteristic that we need in leadership, in a leader. So the 4 C's for me is the kind of leadership which I would like to think is all components of mindful leadership that can somehow begin to lead us out of the problems and predicaments we are facing and will prepare us for the challenges of the future. As I said, if we think that the problems of the last few decades had been driven by the 3 poisons, and we want to overcome that, and we have not yet been able to come up with a system that can tackle all this, we can at least hope that there is some kind of leadership that could begin this process, the mindful leadership or mindful leader with the characteristics that I've mentioned that would then help us in the digital world. If that's the case, so if we think that these characteristics are important, then we then have to somehow help design a political system that will support this kind of leadership. You know, His late Majesty saying that I think sticks to the minds of most Thai people, if only we would heed those words, is that we will never be able to make everybody good. But somehow we have to support the right people to be in the positions of power and leadership. and make sure that the people who don't have those characteristics don't get their hands on power. That's the best guarantee for a society that can make progress, that can be peaceful, that can seek prosperity. So somehow we need to think very hard, not just about making training for individuals to become wiser people, but also how we can design systems to support the kind of leadership that we need. How we can make leaders who are conscious of what's going on, who have the cognitive solutions, who care, who are compassionate, and have a good conscience to succeed in getting and in exercising power. That is the message for me to all of you today. I believe we have maybe about half an hour for discussions and questions and answers session. Thank you very much.
Please, any question? Please, raise your hand.
Sir, thank you very much for your support of IBSC and for being here today. My question has to do with the idea of peace. You know, we have a peace studies PhD here. I would like to know your reflections on something I talked about with a monastic friend in the recent couple of weeks. We wondered, after you have a general outlook like the 4 C's, which for us is very reasonable, I think, what specifically can we do as engaged Buddhists, as socially engaged Buddhists, to promote the actual activities that will bring about mindful leadership? Thank you.
I think I'll go back to one particular aspect that I talked about. I think the way that we have tried to create an understanding among our people about their political duties or duties towards the public interest, much of it still focused on individuals and not systems or the whole. So for instance, when we discuss the issue of rights, everybody starts thinking about what is my right. Okay? You cannot violate my rights. But we don't do enough to make people think about rights in a way, how do you respect the rights of others? And more importantly, what it means for a peaceful or harmonious society in terms of rights of people taken together. Okay? Even when we talk about community rights, we still talk about my community. I want this, I do not want this. We do not want this as a community. We don't try to make people see the issue of rights and duties and responsibilities as a whole. And I think the more we allow or we encourage people to think about how we relate with each other, the easier it would be for us to get action and attitudes that would be beneficial towards peace and harmony. Now, I realize why this is difficult, because if you're not careful and if it's abused, you quickly get to a situation where anti-democratic people can take advantage. Because often, when you violate people's rights, you always say it's for the greater good, without defining of what it is. And I think Margaret Thatcher famously said, that there is no society, there's just a collection of individuals, which is what very much behind her idea of economic progress as ultra individualist, capitalist style of development. So you have to have that right balance where you encourage people to think beyond being individuals without opening the door for somebody to claim some kind of higher ideal or higher good to violate people's rights. And if you get that balance, I think that's probably the best path.
First of all, thank you very much for being here. It's very honor for all students, and thank you, Venerable Dr. Director, to invite His Excellency. My questions, actually, I think it relates to the four characteristics of the leadership. As a leader, actually, I'm your fan 10 years ago. Thank you very much. Being the leadership like the Prime Minister before, or being the leadership of the political party, so you have to face with so many things, the events like last night and all the events, toleralism and all kinds of things, especially the decision. So my question is the first thing, how your mind to be a mindful leadership, how to become stable, beyond like conscious, cognitive care, compassion and conscious leadership, how your mind becomes so stable with so varieties of problems and all kinds of things happening. I mean, not every day, like almost every hour. Second question is how to make the right decision beyond so many options, so many, suggestions and ideas, popping up along the way. Thank you very much.
Right. I think the two questions are actually related, and I mean I will certainly not claim to be an example of everything that is right, but I can tell you how I approach these things, because people often how politicians can keep their sanity in the kind of work that we do. And one of the difficult things is you will never be able to tell whether you still keep your sanity, because usually insane people don't know that they've lost their sanity. But what helped me was, first of all, politics was always my passion from a very young age. So I was attracted to politics by the events of the student protests asking for democracy back in 1973. It inspired me as a very young person that you can actually change the country, you can actually change the world you live in, and you have that right. And so I always wanted to be in politics. It was my choice. You will never hear from me the complaints that, I don't really want to do this, but I have to, and if you don't want to do it, don't do it. If you're there, you want to do it, you just get on with the job. So it was always my passion, and I was in Jantaburi on Friday and with students, and they were asking me, to look back on my career and what has gone right, what has gone wrong. And I say that, the one thing that I'm grateful for is I was given the opportunity to do what I wanted to do. That for me is a big part of happiness in life. So I cannot complain, all right? Second thing is I made it very clear to myself when I decided to join politics that number one, I would have to keep my integrity. Whatever successes or failures I have in politics, measured on whatever criteria by whoever, the one thing for me is I have to keep my principles and my integrity. So for instance, people ask me, do I regret doing this or that and not succeeding? And I say, well, if success by their measure meant I had to compromise some of these principles and ideology, I would rather not. And then that gives me peace of mind. I don't have to lose some sleep because I've done something that I feel I shouldn't have done. That went against myself and my principles. I think that's the most important thing. And then I have this attitude that, in politics, there's so much you cannot control. All right? And something you cannot control, you just don't lose any kind of time and energy complaining about it. You want to go outside and it rains. You can be angry with the weather. That is not going to help you. The rain's not going to go away. The rain's not even aware you're angry at it. But it eats you up inside. So my attitude has always been, if you cannot control it, just accept it. And get on with it. The things you can control, which is your action, you do your best. And you recognize that as a human, your best may not be good enough. And you will make, everybody makes mistakes. So again, when people say, can you look back and say which mistake? No, I don't. Because you can't change the past. All you know is, last time you failed, if you want to try to succeed, you don't do the same thing. You have to do something new. And I think that's what keeps me sane, keeps me happy with what I did or what I do. And so when you have this, when I adopt this attitude, the decisions that I made on the basis of principles, on the basis of what I know, and what I know should be a result of actively seeking the right information. As much information as you can in a given or appropriate time frame, because you'll never be able to get everything before you make a decision. But you do the best you can. You have the information, and then you have the principle that you have to apply it to the information you have, and you make a decision. And sometimes that will be seen as the right decision. That's well and good. Sometimes it will be seen as a wrong decision, and you have to take responsibility for it. And sometimes it could be the right decision, but unpopular. And you have to have that courage to say, it's more important to do right than to be popular. Because I think ultimately, the politicians that make unpopular but right decisions will have a much longer shelf life than politicians who can please everybody but have no principles. And that's the way I operate. Lots of hands going up, so.
Yes. May I have some questions? Yes.
Okay, all right. Is it ladies first or monks first?
I'm not sure. You the first one. You the first one. After
Okay.
you.
Ladies first. Okay.
Okay. I have some question according to your mindful leadership. You're very smart. I think about I learned about globalization, and I learned about economics in globalization. I think it has a lot of impact nowadays through marketing concept. How do we can stop the greeting of the marketing concept throughout the world, because it is related to many countries. And I think in the future we have a lot of big gap between the hunger, the poor and the rich. And also in the future, maybe in maybe 5 years, I think the ratio between the old people and the young people is about 5 to 1. What do you think about that? How do we stop and we stay peaceful in this world?
Okay. There are quite a handful of questions hidden in that one question. Let me start with this problem of marketing and this issue of greed and so on. As I said, I think we should all try to train people to be able to control their greed, but we have to accept the reality that people will always seek something for themselves. So what's important is what I would call the need to have responsibilities in activities like marketing. All right? Two things. Number one is inevitably in a market or capitalist system, things will be sold to the people who have the money. So, for instance, in a study of famines in the past, you will discover that famines that have taken place in so many places in the world, there was never a shortage of food. But food doesn't go to the hungry. Food goes to the people who can pay for food. All right? That's the nature of the market system. So it's up to the leaders to make sure that somehow you regulate the market system so that you don't destroy the incentives, but you don't allow unfettered greed to dominate. That's from the point of view of the leader or the government. The second thing is we have to encourage marketing that plays on informed decision. All right? I mean, we're all bombarded with marketing these days. You cannot escape all the things that pop up and try to sell you things. Actually, based on your own behavior as well, because they have this algorithm that will feed you the things that they think you'll be attracted to. But a lot of it is playing on the emotions. It works, just like political marketing. It's all about tapping into emotions. But somehow we have to try to make the business of marketing or of even political campaigns more and more on making informed decisions. Why is Britain suffering from Brexit? Because the people who went to vote in the Brexit referendum didn't really know what Brexit meant. I'm not sure now whether a lot of people know what Brexit is going to mean. So if we can make marketing more responsible, if we can make marketing more based on encouraging people to make informed decisions, you will help lessen the problem that is created by greed. The issue of an aging society. Number one, we will be helped by technology. So the usual fear is that if there are less working people, there's going to be less income generated to help the people who need to be dependent on people who are working. But with technology, if we use it right, you don't need the same amount of people to create the same amount of resources or income. You can generate that with less people. So technology, if used rightly, will help reduce the problem of not having enough working people. For countries like Thailand, I think we have to come to the reality that there has to be, we have to accept the role of foreign labor. There's plenty of that already in Thailand, but we often don't accept the reality of it. And the way we design our system is really not realistic, which means there are a lot of unreported or illegal people working, which is not healthy for the system as a whole, economically, or not even good for security. So that has to be addressed. But, things are changing because when you talk about old people, it used to be the case that we felt that, oh, if you're over 60, you retire. I see people in their 70s, in their 80s today, who can make very important contributions to the economy, to education, and so on. Maybe I'm biased because I'm becoming 60 soon, so, but I felt that, when I was young, oh, people who are 60, they're very old. They have to stay at home, you have to look after them. But now I feel that maybe into the 70s you can still be active and do things. So, but that's because we have a longer lifespan as well. So that will also help. But ultimately, the biggest challenge for countries like Thailand is to design a welfare system that will ensure that there is security for everybody, economic security or social security for everybody. And the bigger challenge is how we pay for that. And that's a problem that is going to be faced by all governments, because unfortunately the digital economy is making it very difficult for governments to collect income or taxes, especially taxes that will help rather than exacerbate the issue of inequality, because direct taxes will be much more difficult to collect. So lots of governments around the world will just basically put up value-added tax, which is not good for equality. So that's the main thing. Okay.
Thank you, Abhisit. I would like to know that political conflict based on different religion, different culture, different human life. For example, in our country, there are so many political conflict based on different religion, different culture. How to resolve your opinion this problem?
I think it's part of human nature. We're always more comfortable with things we are familiar with. And the first reaction when you see something different is a bit of suspicion, is a bit of fear, a bit of anxiety. And when you have a society with diverse groups of people, the best thing you can do is to train people, especially at a very young age, to learn about the existing diversity and to understand each other better, and so they don't have the biases and prejudices that will be problematical, that leads to conflicts. So if a child at a very young age gets to be friends, to be familiar with people of different colors, different religions, different ethnicities, they have no problem in living harmoniously with people who are different from them. But the more we put up walls between people, the more distance there is, the less understanding there is. Which is why I think it's so ironic that in an age where people can actually learn so much about different things, we have become in many ways more narrow-minded. And partly this is due to technology also. That's because it's ironic that in the old days, when there wasn't so much information available, which is not a good thing, the benefit of it was actually people then had to basically learn the same things. So in the old days, when you had 2, 3 national television stations, despite the lack of information or the poor quality, the whole society consumes the same set of information, which makes it easier for them to understand each other. But now we can all choose, right? So we don't like this brand of politics. We don't actually now read or learn anything about people who think differently. We spend all our time with like-minded people. We spend all our time confirming our own beliefs and biases rather than be active to seek out different viewpoints. I don't have an answer to this, but it's going to be an uphill struggle, but it has to be done. You have to encourage people to say, look, get out of your group, learn about other people, try to understand people who you don't agree with. Otherwise, we will never overcome this conflict in politics and in society. Yep, I can. It's right here.
Good mornings, and Excellency, and also my directors from Mahansa. Actually today we are very privileged to you are here with us and also give a lot of knowledge. Very much we are appreciate for your knowledge. All the sectors of politicals, religious, mindfulness, we are really helpful for our life, I think. And my questions, as you told, that we have to must be the respect the diversity of the culture and diversity of the religious and everything. But still, just the questions coming from the monks, and you are given the good answers. But I want to know what the form, even the conflict comes or occurs, what the governments do the rules or play the rules or positions they do this to solving this. Because the last questions, and you given the how to be we play, but what the governments, they play rules.
Right. Okay. Leadership is important because you can be a divisive leader, or you can try and be a leader that brings people together. All right? And unfortunately, the divisive leaders appear to be doing rather well in the current state of affairs, because when you have a polarized society, it's always easy to just play to your base and get that support by confirming that you're just one of them. But if you want to lead society out of this predicament, you yourself have to step out of that. So the leadership has to be less divisive in language, in action, in policies. Which is why I said, well, we need to design a system that will help leaders who want to bring people together to succeed and not allow divisiveness to succeed. It's not working now because the system appears to work for divisive leaders, which is why we see leaders, making very divisive comments. And, people who disagree will say, oh, but why is he saying this? It's nonsensical. It's going to damage. It doesn't damage the leader because the leader is strengthening his own support. So individually we have to train people to be less divisive, but collectively we have to find a system that will not reward divisiveness, would not reward violent languages, would not reward a confirmation of biases that we want to get rid of.
Sir? Here.
Sure.
While I agree with many of the ideals you've expressed, I have to confess that I do not totally agree with some of the examples and what's the reality on the ground. I'm not Thai. Okay, I have to say very quickly first.
That doesn't mean we have to disagree.
You've mentioned, you've given an excellent presentation based on your viewpoint as a political leader, and particularly, specifically from a Thai perspective. Whereas for me, I've seen things. I've seen how the world, the globalized world, has taken on a different tone, and you focus mostly on material world. But what I've witnessed is there's a transformation, a spiritual dimension in what's happening around the world today that's actually behind some of the events and so on. The question, you, political leader...
Would you like to elaborate on that? Give me an example so we can understand your viewpoint about this spiritual change. So
It's everywhere in the world. It's happening everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
In what direction? And you know, so we can understand.
Okay. Specifically, I would say across most of the major religions, there's a feeling, all right, these are the end days. Even in Buddhism, it's the second half of the world life cycle. And it's going to be inevitable. Some of the, the climate changes and so on, because Buddha himself said the world is going to end with the drying up of the oceans and the seas and the 7 suns coming up.
Okay.
I'm interested to hear what's the advice you have for the Sangha, for the spiritual leaders of the future, based on your political experiences in the material world, because it's about karma saka, all right? It's about collective karma of nations. You touched on how it's very important to create systems that take care of, everyone. That's where I disagree with you. I'm sorry, I disagree with you. Because you're coming from the perspective of a person, pardon me for saying this, because having worked in business with in Thailand before, and having had a business associate who belongs to the Thai nobility, okay, I realize how deeply entrenched class is in Thailand. As in UK, where I've lived for a number of years, it's very class entrenched.
Right.
And your viewpoints, the inferences you make of people's choices, the assumptions you have, very much colored by your class. And even though you deem it good to step out of your world to talk to people at the other end, you may still not be able to really experience the karuna.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Why? You think you know what's best. And I'm not saying this in a judgmental way. I'm saying this because I mixed with the upper class in the UK and the upper class in Thailand when I was doing business before I turned to spirituality. And it's a divide, it is in a way a spiritual divide, because I do take offense when you refer to entrepreneurs as greedy, because I was once an entrepreneur who across 3 countries. I see it as wealth creation rather than greed. And actually, there's quite a number of points. So I come back to the spiritual side, which is why I'm here today. From your political leadership experience, what advice can you offer to the Sangha here, the future spiritual leaders, on mindful leadership?
Okay. Before I answer the question, let me just address a couple of issues that might clear up or make us reach a better understanding. This issue of greed and wealth creation. I never said that entrepreneurs are greedy. What I said was that in human nature, we are driven by our incentives to make material gains. All right? I'm not condemning that, because we all have that, I have that. What I'm saying is that you have to be careful that the system does not encourage greed. That's different from saying that entrepreneurs are greedy. And I'll give you an example. Recently, if you follow the US political news, a presidential candidate, Elizabeth Warren, talks about taxing wealth. And you've got a group of businessmen coming out saying they will not endorse Elizabeth Warren because she was going to take away wealth and give it to poor people. Now, if that's not greed, I don't know what is. All right? So I'm not saying everybody's greedy. I'm not saying that entrepreneurship is greedy. I actually, on the contrary, say it's necessary to make the economic system work. But there has to be a limit. And there has to be a system that is designed to prevent excessive seeking of wealth or even wealth creation. It's fine if you create wealth and that wealth can be redistributed as well. But I don't see the point of creating wealth for people who no longer need the wealth. And that wealth cannot even serve anybody else. And that's the problem I'm talking about. And that's where this is where we've reached this state of affairs in the world. Because before, you've never had these super rich people. In the old days, actually these people would be taxed, 70, 80%? These days, everybody says, no, you cannot tax. You cannot even increase their taxes because it would destroy their incentive to create wealth. Well, where is the wealth going? All right? When you have a handful of people having as much wealth as the rest of the world, I think something is wrong. So I'm not blaming individuals, but I'm saying that somehow we have allowed greed to be too much part of the system and the engine of how it works that we forget. Why are we creating wealth? Why do we want people to create wealth? Because we want that wealth to be shared and for everyone to benefit from it. Not always equally. I'm not naive enough to say, everybody has to have an equal share. But surely it cannot be right that there are still people who are suffering so much, and there is so many people. There are a few people who are, have more wealth and resources that they can ever spend, even if they had 100 lives, to live. So, just to clear it up first, all right. Spiritually, when you say that, we may come to the end or whatever. I don't dispute that. And my own personal feeling is we're probably heading that way. Are our views colored by our background? Of course. Of course. I accept that. But, when I decided to go into politics, I come from not a rich, but a well-off enough family. But what democracy does, it forces me to go and learn about the problems of people of different backgrounds. Now, I can't pretend, and I don't think anybody can pretend that, when you start meeting, learning, and trying to serve those people, you fully understand. Of course, you won't have the first-hand experience of people from different backgrounds in you. But the good thing about democracy is that at least it forces you to try and learn and understand so that you can serve them. I don't pretend that it's perfect, but surely it's better than having a system where people who have power don't ever have to understand or try to seek the support of those people. So I think I understand that this issue of entrenchment of class is very much a problem, and immobility between the economic strata is a big problem, which is why it's so important that you have not just a wealth-creating process, but a wealth-sharing process, or allowing opportunities for people to have the chance of moving up the ladder. Okay, so I think we disagree less than you think. Okay, now, do I have an advice for the Sangha? I wouldn't dare give advices. But I would make some requests. All right? Number one, we need to make religion more relevant for people. All right? So I don't want to see religion as something people resort to because, they suffer, they are disappointed, they are not doing well, and so they're trying to seek something. It's important, but religion can do so much more. If religion is seen to be relevant, more directly relevant to people's lives, all right? And it's tricky here because it's important to try to keep the state and political power separate from religion. Otherwise, religion risks being used as a political tool. But at the same time, you don't want to remove religion from society. And a good example here in Thailand is religion used to be very much an integral part of the education system. Right? That's why in the old days all the schools belonged to temples. Right? And temples were very much the center of a community. But now there's a stronger separation of functions, so religion plays much less of a role in the education process. And frankly speaking, when you try to remove religion from everything, then religion sort of becomes a kingdom in itself, and that's not healthy. Because religion should be part of everybody's life, right? At least the teaching or the principles should be part. But when people sort of see religion as somewhat removed from them, something that they sort of seek if they want to, and I think that's my first request. Can we try to make religion or the religious world more relevant to people's lives? And by relevant, that leads to second and third thing. Second thing is because the world is changing all the time, there will be new problems, new challenges, new trends that somehow we will have to make people understand how religious principles can be applied. Gender politics is one area I think that will be very challenging as far as all religions is concerned. Because clearly the role of women in society and what they can do and what they cannot is something that all religions will now have to grasp with, because it's clearly different from the days when all these all the major religions started. So there has to be some kind of reapplication of basic principles, if you like. And that brings me to the third thing, which is that and this is a good comparison with the problems of Thai society. In Thailand, we sort of try to interpret all the laws by the letter rather than by its intention and objective. There's always a risk that religion can fall into that trap, because there is a written scriptures teaching, and if you interpret it letter by letter, you may not be applying it in the way the scriptures are intended. So those would be my requests, not advices to this. Yeah. Right. So I can make somebody who disagrees with me smile. So that's. Right.
Hello. Before I get on to my questions, if we go back to the point that you said that about income distribution, you cannot make everyone with the same fair amount of income, because that would be communism. But if we see most of the wealthy one are the one who influence the politicians or setting up the tax system and all that. Well, that's the point. But my question is, your point on the 4C, whether it's consciousness, cognitive,
Caring, conscience.
caring, compassion, and conscience. It's good. I mean, if I would summarize all that, that would be a sati, whatever. But I know your point. But how do you derive at the politician to reach that state, to have that kind of qualities? I know that it should start young, but they are already at that age. And you said that it's not your job to teach people this mindfulness, it's the venerable job. But how can this venerable have the airtime or the stage or the,
Right.
how can they
By becoming
influence?
more relevant to people's lives, which was my previous answer.
If I take at the point, like for example, like stock market, you have stock exchange commission who control. Whatever control you set up, you will always have people who deviate or try to find points to get around it. So wouldn't it be better, with this stock exchange commission, Bank of Thailand, to also train people who come into this area of business, whether you call it soft subject or anything, but you give more weight into, I would not say the controlling greed, because all this, if you say controlling greed or hatred and all that, it's not easy. It's to lessen it, or to teach people how to be mindful of their actions, to teach the youngsters. They are addicted to this digital world, to all this. How can they use it mindfully? Not as all the news. They are more interested in all this hate speech and all the good news about the monks, about all the work they do. These people are not interested. How can we teach, or how can we bring the political people in the political arena, whether the politicians or their school or their university, to reach your point, to have consciousness, to have this cognitive, to be compassion, or the last one to be conscience?
Right, okay. First of all, when I said it's not my job, it's actually everybody's job. My point is, when we talk about grooming or bringing up individuals, it's a job of families, it's a job of schools, it's a job of people in society. And it's something that we all have to do, as a citizen, as a father, as a teacher, as a whatever. But I wanted to separate that from the need to have a system that will help us on the right track. So it goes beyond just the training of individuals, because the reality is we will never be able to make everybody good, as I keep insisting. So a good system is one that can somehow keep the bad things in check and encourage good things to happen. And you will never be able to design a system or write a law which everybody will respect. But it's important that you write a law that sets the right standards in terms of reflecting certain values, and you have to punish people who violate. Now, the failure of one of the biggest problems of Thai society is we don't often enforce the law in the way we should. And when we allow people who clearly violate the law to get away with things, we encourage people who want to not respect the law or get around the law. So, you can't have a foolproof system, but you have to try to design one that will get you as far as possible. And in terms of individuals, how we train them, as I say, it's really the job of everybody. But then there's a feedback loop here, because so if you talk about schools having to do this, then you also have to design an education system that allows and encourages schools to do this. At the moment, we don't do that, because at school we attach more importance to other things, and this becomes something that is not part of or seen to be the real objective of education. I mean, one of the important things of education is to build characters into people, and yet in our education system, for instance, you don't really see how this character building is being done, because there's just so much going into emphasis on succeeding in, say, written exams, which in themselves have problems because it was more about rote learning and memorization rather than systems or thinking in a systematic way. So I mean, there's a lot of work for everybody to do. I think that all of us need to reflect and review on how we can do things better in our individual capacity, as well as collectively trying to improve the system design to get us where we want to be.
Thank you very much to Kun Abhisit for being with us here today and for giving such a remarkable speech to all of us. It's indeed very interesting and such a thought-provoking perspective on politics, region, and mindful leadership in a digital world. Now may I please invite Associate Professor Dr. Paramahansa Dhammahaso to offer a gift of appreciation to Kun Abhisit, our guest of honor here today.